Hey everyone, thanks for the overview, Becky, and welcome back everyone. We're happy to have you join us for the second webinar in the 2016 Ship Lean Training and Mini Project. I want to provide you with just a quick rundown of what we'll be doing on today's webinar. John will be teaching us about some lean tools and how you can apply them in your facility, and particularly how you can consider using them when you're getting ready to launch your mini project. We'll review the next assignment, which is completing your project charter in preparation for your project, and we'll spend some time talking about identifying appropriate measures for your project. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end, but we encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions throughout our time together. To start things off, we want to hear from you. Since our last time together during webinar 1, you've all completed your waste walks, and so we want to hear about how your waste walks went. The options are on your screen there in the poll. Good, we learned a lot, and/or we plan on doing waste walks for other projects in the future. Okay, we felt a little shaky and we'll need more practice with Lean before doing them again, or not great, the process was confusing to us, and/or we didn't see much value in doing the waste walks. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer the poll question there. Okay, great. Got a couple people still answering, but we'll go ahead and call it a success. We didn't have anyone who said that they didn't see any value in doing the waste walks, which is wonderful. We're glad that many of you felt that the process was positive and that you're planning on doing the waste walks again for future projects, or that you just need some more practice. It's understandable if this is your first time trying them out that you might not have felt super comfortable with it, but hopefully it was a good exercise for you. John, I know you had some positive feedback for the group as a whole.
Yeah, I want to congratulate everybody on the waste walk and what you identified and the lessons learned. I thought we've been doing this. This is our third go-around, and I thought as a whole, all the participants did about as well as we've ever seen. So I want to take my hat off to everybody. I know it's like any skill. When you get started on it, it's you don't know if you're doing it right. You don't know quite exactly what you're doing. It feels uncomfortable. But I was very pleased with the results that you turned in and the observations you made. I know it's difficult sometimes. You know, the things that I had difficulty when I first started doing lean waste walks were, you know, which category does this really fit into, and trying to figure out, is this motion, is this overproduction, and so I'm sure you felt that's the strain of trying to figure out which category it went into. And then also another area that I struggle with in the beginning and still do sometimes is this a symptom of the problem? Is this really the waste that I see, or is there a root cause that I need to dig deeper into that's really causing this kind of waste? And then the final one is really looking at, is this non-value added waste but required because of compliance or regulations? Identifying the pure waste is pretty easy, and identifying the value is also more straightforward, but it gets kind of murky sometimes when we try to look at the non-value added waste, and but it's required in the process because of regulations or compliance purposes. But kudos to everybody. I thought you did a great job on the waste walks. It's like any skill, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And so I would encourage you to keep doing it, and you'll definitely get better at it as you keep on. I think we're ready to go into today's presentation, but I thought I'd kind of get you all in the mood today by telling you a little story, a little joke. Hopefully gets everybody in the mood for the presentation. There was a glass of water sitting at the hospital cafeteria, And as they say, the glass was half full with water. And so they asked several people around the table, you know, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? Well, of course, the pessimist in the crowd said the glass is half empty. The optimist in the crowd said the glass, oh, it's definitely half full. They asked the quality control manager, and they said, well, it appears to be a clear, odorless liquid, but we're going to have to run several tests on it to make sure. And then the consultant, people like me, come in and say, you know, I've looked at this from every angle, and from my expert opinion, I think it's whatever you think it is. And then the lean champion says, well, obviously, the glass is twice as big as it needs to be. I love that. It's a good introduction to what we're going to do today and what we've done with the waste walks. And again, looking at your facility and your processes through a different set of eyes, a different lens. And so that's what we want to continue talking about today, and looking at some of the lean tools that you can use to begin to, after you've identified the waste and the process breakdowns, that you can use to begin to look at improving your processes and eliminating that waste. On today's agenda, we're going to look at 4 lean tools, and I'd like you to kind of visualize these 4 tools kind of as a spoke and hub. These 4 tools are really the hub, I think, of much of what you'll use when you're using lean in your organization. And from these hubs, then we can also use other lean tools to complement these different areas to dig deeper into some of the issues that we're facing as an organization in trying to identify waste and develop a process improvement. Again, in the world of lean tools, there are a tremendous number of lean tools that you can use, and sometimes, as we talked about in the first webinar, that can be somewhat overwhelming to think about, how do I possibly learn all these different tools? How do I know what they're used for in the correct way? And how do I know to make sure that I'm using them correctly? So I think the 4 lean tools that we're going to use today can, from my experience in working with small rural hospitals, these 4 tools can really, I think, solve about 95% of the issues that you're going to deal with. And so that's why we're going to focus in on these 4 particular tools. Again, when you get into some of these tools, you'll use other lean tools to further study and determine what course of action you're going to use. But these 4 basic tools will, if you learn them and do well with them, will serve you well in your facility. So I think we'll stop here and have a little poll question.
Yeah, so before John covers all of these tools, we're interested to know, are you familiar with any of these lean tools? So please select which one or ones you've used in the past and are comfortable with, or indicate if you're not familiar with any of them at all, which is perfectly fine. Great. So it looks like we've got a few newbies in the crowd, which is wonderful. That's the reason that we're here. It also looks like we've got some folks who are comfortable and familiar with a number of the tools, particularly value stream mapping and 5S worksite organization. So we're certainly John's going to cover all of these tools, and there are additional resources available on the Moodle course site for those of you who are interested in learning above and beyond what he presents today.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Well, the first tool we're going to take a look at is the value stream mapping tool. And this is a quote from Jim Womack, and he talks about in his book, Lean Thinking, wherever there's a product or a service for a customer, there's a value stream. And the challenge is really, how do we see that? How do we see actually how the process flows? What are the steps in that process? What is the materials and the information that have to flow along with that process? So the value stream mapping tool basically is a visual representation of the actual process. And again, it gives, I think, a powerful communication tool when you can be able to see the process visually instead of just seeing it in a policy manual or just trying to identify it without making it visible. So it's really, the purpose of it is to go see the flow, see how things are flowing through the organization, through this particular process. And it's based on three really different areas. The value stream map looks at the information flow, what information has to flow along with the process, what are the material and data flow that have to go along with it, and then we begin to try to bring in a time element. How much time does each particular step in the process take, and how much wait time or how much processing time. So it starts to give us an idea of what the process is and how it looks in our organization. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about what is a process. Basically, a process is just a set of steps that transform one or more inputs, again, into one or more outputs. I think we covered some of this in the first webinar. Again, we're looking at inputs going into a process that produce an output that is of value to our customer. And again, if you can't describe what that process is, you're really going to have a difficult time of knowing how to correct that process or what variations you're seeing in that process. So that's why the value stream map is very helpful in helping us to identify exactly what the process is. And again, as we talked about in the first webinar, we really want to describe the value stream from the perspective of the patient. We want to know, again, why and how it's valuable. And again, that's where the voice of the customer comes in. We want to take note of all the actions and tasks involved in the value stream, begin to note which ones are value added and which ones are non-value added, and which ones are just pure waste. And again, your waste walks and building up that skill will help you identify that. The other thing we want to do in a value stream is to really identify what the scope is about that we're looking in which part of the process, and making sure that we understand which part of the process we're really looking at. The purpose of the value stream map is to really give us a common understanding of what our current process is and the relationship between the different steps in the process. It'll give us a great baseline to know where we're at and to know what metrics and what improvements we need to put in place, and then whether or not those improvements are actually making the process better. One of the things that I see a lot in the work that I do with our clients is that they may identify a problem in the value stream. They put in some kind of corrective action, and then they just assume that a corrective action is taking care of the problem. So they really need the baseline data so that they know that whatever countermeasures they put in place are actually working. Again, it gives us a great vision for kind of where we're at and where we want to be with our future processes, and it gives us kind of an action plan to be able to look at how to implement the improvements that we want to make. Our goals in the value stream mapping are very simple and straightforward. We want to, again, define value from the customer's point of view. We want to maximize the value-added steps. We want to minimize the non-value-added but required, and we want to eliminate the steps that are just pure waste. The value stream map is very helpful. Again, it helps us visualize the connections, the interactions, and the flow of the materials through our process. It helps us quickly identify and eliminate waste. One of the things that we'll talk about here in just a second is the Kaizen bursts that you can identify when you go through this process. Just the low-hanging fruit that is just purely waste that you'll identify in that process. It helps us to look at the constraints where possibly we have resource allocations that are not sufficient enough that cause bottlenecks in the process, or that we do something like batching that holds the process up from the folks downstream. And again, it helps the employees really identify and understand what the process is so that they can contribute to looking at the process and identifying the way it truly is. So the first step we do is we take and map out the current state. We want to really look at it as it actually is and actually works on a day-to-day basis. And you can see in front of you that we use a lot of sticky notes during this process, and that is our high-tech way of really laying out the current map. And it works really well because, as you'll see, as people in the group, as your team gets discussing exactly how the process really works, you'll see that there will be variation from different people's perspectives on how the process actually works. And so when you use a sticky note process, you can move those sticky notes around as you really gain more information and perspective about how the process currently is working. Value stream map teams usually are comprised of 3 to 8 people, led by a team leader. And again, they are looking precisely at identifying the current value stream map, how things are really working. And so you want people from different parts of the organization. You want definitely frontline people. You want other folks who are very close to that process to be involved with it. Again, they're the ones that know the work up front and close because they're doing it each and every day. And again, the more perspectives you get from the team, the better outcomes you're going to have. One of the things we do when we're doing some value stream mapping and putting the team together is bring somebody in from another department that has no idea what the process really looks like. And you'd be really amazed sometimes their perspective of not knowing what a process is and why you do things a certain way. They can bring a whole new dynamic into that and ask questions like, well, why do you do it that way? And those of us who work in that process all the time really just take some of those things for granted. And so it can be a really great way to bring a new set of eyes in and a different perspective on the project and the value stream map. We encourage folks to actually walk the process. This is what's called a Gemba walk. Just so there's no confusion between a Gemba walk and a waste walk. A Gemba walk is really Japanese for go and see the actual process. And unlike when you're going on a waste walk, when you're looking at specific and identifying specific waste, in a Gemba walk, you're really looking and doing the walk to observe, to really begin to think about some of the problems that you're looking at and identifying, to really focus on the value stream and what the process and what the steps are in that process. And then really beginning to look at how people function in that process. And again, we want to, what's called in the Toyota Motor Corporation lean process is have a respect for people. We really want to observe the process in its actual, as it actually works. And again, that's why we do and encourage people to go do the Gemba walk. To get started with the value stream mapping, we identify the boundaries, which is very important because it can, if you don't identify the boundaries of what you're looking at, what what generally happens is that you get a scope creep, as we call it. As you get into it and look at your value stream more, you add more things to it because most of our processes in our facilities are very complex. And so we really want to define the value is, again, what the value is to the patient, identify the specific tasks and flows, and the resources we might need. And again, we create that current state map. Here's a sample of a current state map for a patient office visit. Again, you'll see the boxes, which are the biggest steps in the process. Reception, going back to the nurse, what the nurse does, what the physician's job is, back to the nurse, and then the checkout. So those are our big process areas. And then within those are certain tasks that we have to accomplish. So again, we begin to see the flow of this particular process, and then we can begin to put a time element to it and begin to see where we might have bottlenecks, where we have long waiting times, or where we have value versus non-value added time. So this will give you kind of a good snapshot of what we're looking at when we're identifying the current state. Once we identify and really feel like we have a good handle on the current state map, our next goal in the value stream mapping process is to define what the future state map is. And basically the question we want to ask is, if we could design this process any way we could to make it the most efficient, make the flow go through the process most efficiently, what would that look like? Again, we want to look at what that process would be if we could just do it and make it flow perfectly throughout our organization. When we identify the current state map, as I talked about earlier, we can see we use what we call Kaizen bursts. Kaizen is a burst is just those improvements that we can make right away. And they're the low-hanging fruit. They're the aha moment where you think, well, that step doesn't even need to be in this process. And so we can identify and eliminate those and then move on to the more complex issues as we begin to develop that future state map. So when we're looking at developing that future state map, again, we want to eliminate any long lead times or queue times. We want to maximize the value-added steps. We want to make sure that all of our equipment, our materials, our supplies, the information that flows along that value stream are coming in at the correct time. Again, going back to that concept of push and pull in our value stream. Once we create the future state map and compare it to the current state map, again, we kind of develop this implementation plan that we can use to move from the current state to the future state. And again, one of the things that I see in that people have a lot of difficulty with in this step is that there can be quite a few things that they see that they want to change from the current state to the future state. And you really have to go through a process of prioritizing those items, those action items, making sure that you're not biting off more than you can chew, and that you have a realistic implementation plan. When people, teams that I've worked with try to bite off too much, it really can get discouraging, and over time they lose interest, and because it's just so difficult. So the implementation plan really is key to making sure that you're successful in implementing the new value stream that you've identified. Some of the keys to success in the value stream are making sure we have a well-rounded team of on our value stream mapping process. We've got the right people in the room. We've got people that are empowered to identify and suggest changes in the process. We need to make sure that everyone's engaged in the process and that everyone is equal in the process. We're kind of notorious in hospitals for kind of a pecking order and we need to make sure that everybody feels like they have an equal say on the value stream mapping team. We focus on process and not people, and that can be very difficult at times. Again, we want to look at value stream mapping and the issues that we see in the process from the perspective of this is a process issue. And if the process isn't working correctly, how can our people possibly implement that process correctly? And so keep your focus on the process and not the people, and agree on the measures and how you're going to collect those. We're going to talk a lot at the end of the webinar about measurements and making sure that as we get into your projects that you're thinking up front about how you're going to measure the project and how you're going to know you've accomplished what you wanted to in making changes to your value stream. So that's just a quick overview of the value stream mapping process. The only things that I would say in addition to what we covered is that value stream mapping is generally used for more complex processes. Usually takes a little longer period of time than maybe a 5S or an A3 tool, but it is a very powerful tool. But it does take more time and is more complex, but certainly the results can be very significant when you implement a good value stream mapping process. So we'll move on to the next tool, which is the 5S worksite organization. 5S stands for sort, set in order, shine, standardize, and sustain. It's really a worksite organization tool that we can use to, again, eliminate waste, particularly in the areas of motion and inventory. Those are the two areas, two waste, I think, are we can use the 5S to really make some significant gains for the organization. 5S is really a discipline for what we call a visual workplace and looking at using visual controls to help manage our process and our system. And you'll see as we go along how that visual workplace really plays out. So when we look at the model and the different areas, when we're looking at sort, we're looking at basically a place for everything and everything in its place. That's really the motto for the sorting. We need to take out all the materials, tools, supplies, parts, whatever, from our areas that we don't use. And this can be pretty emotional for a lot of folks in facilities. The reason is that we want to make sure we have that just in case thinking. We haven't used that particular supply or piece of equipment for 5 or 6 years, but we just might need it in the next week, and so we hang on to those things. And so I think you really have to take a realistic look at getting those things out of your workspace area if they're really not going to be needed. Set in order, again, is putting everything in its place and having a place for everything. Shine is making sure that our workspace is cleaned and functional as possible. Standardizing is making sure we're implementing protocols and procedures that keep how we've reorganized our workspace, make sure it stays that way. I think you all have been in the situation where we've made changes to a certain area, reorganized it, and then slowly, like a drip over time, it kind of reverts back to what it was or not as functional as we first hoped it would be in the design. The fifth S is sustain. We want to develop policies and procedures to make sure that we're keeping whatever we redesigned in place. Sometimes you'll hear the 6S in healthcare, and that's just looking at your worksite organization with safety in mind, both the safety of the patient and the safety of the folks working in that particular workspace. As you know, in your waste walks, waste occurs when we have supplies that are not properly maintained, or we have what we talked about earlier of hoarding supplies, or going around looking for supplies. Again, all these worksite organization issues can contribute to the 7 different types of waste that we looked at. We want to minimize, again, these wastes through reorganizing and really looking at our workspace and making sure that we have what we need when we need it, right very close at hand. So anytime I suggest folks go into a 5S project, I think it's always helpful to begin to document the current conditions. And so we have folks take a lot of pictures of the current condition and what they look like. And you can see from the slides that these are pictures from some actual projects that we worked with facilities on. And what you see is unorganized benches. You see the flow is not really obvious to what the person may be doing. We see people running around looking for supplies, poor utilization of space, and again, just an unorganized way of looking at our workspace. So when we put the proper use of the 5S into place, it helps us decrease the waste of space. It helps us with our people resources. It improves safety. It improves the overall quality of our care. And it helps us decrease staff motion and improve the flow of the organizations. Those are all the goals we're looking for when we implement a 5S process. So again, just to go quickly over the steps again and kind of give you a visual of how that looks before and after. Step 1 is sorting the needed from the not needed. So you can see on the left-hand side this supply cart before we got 5S process started, and then afterwards again. And you can see a lot of techniques in some of these before and after pictures. Step 2, set an order. We want plates for everything and everything in its place. We want it to be logical. We want people who may not work in that area on a day-to-day basis to be able to come into that area and just kind of instinctively or intuitively know what the organization of this particular storage area might be. So you see on the right-hand side, they put a poster up of the entire storeroom and then where all the different supplies are located so that somebody, again, could come in, look at that, find what they need pretty quickly. 3 is to shine, to make sure that our workspace is clean, that's tidy, that we inspect all the equipment, ensure it's in good working condition, and making sure that everything, again, is in a functional order to be able to do that the best. Step 4, standardizing. Here's a picture of an equipment room, and you can see the standardization that's taking place. On the floor is, you'll see the blue line where that piece of equipment goes to and where it should be stored. And then you'll see the purple stickers where it tells which piece of equipment should be stored there. And again, you can easily see if you come into that room and there's a piece of equipment missing, you know that it's missing and you know which piece of equipment it is. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a storeroom where there's equipment for the patient rooms, and everything's just tossed into one big room, and you have no idea which piece of equipment is in there or not in there. You have to move other pieces of equipment to get to the one you need. And again, the 5S process and the standardization really helps with that. The 5th S is sustain. So to really get the gains that we're going to make through this 5S process, we have to develop protocol to make sure that somebody's responsible to make sure that the organization, the reorganization that we've done with the work site stays in place. And so somebody has to be accountable and responsible for that. And that's really the 5th step of how we sustain the gains over time. Again, just to go over the standardization process, because it's probably the most critical in the 5S process, so we don't, again, degrade back to an unorganized workspace, is to integrate the 5S duties into people's regular work duties. So, for instance, some clients we worked with, the ER nurse, her first duty when she comes on in her shift is to go through and do a checklist and make sure that she has all the supplies and equipment that she needs to be able to function throughout her shift. And so each nurse on a different shift, that's their job, to make sure that they have everything they need to begin that process on their shift. Again, when we look at the set and order phase, we really want to look at the flow of our work and make sure that we're eliminating any unnecessary motion. Below you would see another lean tool called the spaghetti map, where we actually track the motion of somebody as they go through a process, whether it's a laboratory, doing a laboratory test, or through nursing and just tracking people as they go through the process for the day. And again, we want to really look at that and make sure that it has a good flow of one stage to another, and we're not running back and forth across the department to perform a test and to do the steps within that test. So again, we want to really look at that process and make sure that it's flowing. And sometimes that means reorganizing the equipment and where it's located and making sure it flows better. Because many times when we get a new piece of equipment, where does it go? It goes in the space where we have nothing else. And so again, we want to really look at where things are located and making sure we have a good flow of the process. Again, we talked about a visual workspace, and one of the keys to 5S is using a color coding system to help people be able to find what they need quickly. And again, that can be used in a variety of different ways. Use different colors to signify different types of supplies, or a lot of different ways that you can use visual cues. So I think 5S is probably one of the best ways to get into lean. I think it's a great way for your teams to really kind of get into lean and understand it better. We generally, when we work with facilities, we generally have them start with a 5S project because it really does hammer home what we're trying to accomplish with lean, and that is looking at creating better flow, creating better value for our patients, and reducing or eliminating waste. So 5S is really a great tool to really organize worksite and to really begin to understand the principles of lean. So let's go to next the A3 problem solving tool. And let's talk a little bit about just problem solving in general. You know, why is it so hard for us as organizations to solve problems? It's really because there's a gap between where we're at right now and where we really want to be. And everybody looks at it from a different perspective of what the solution is or how to bridge that gap. And so sometimes it can be difficult because people don't feel comfortable or don't know specifically how to solve problems. I'm always amazed to go in and work with the facility and ask, you know, how long has this been a problem? And somebody will say 18 months, a couple of years, and we really haven't been able to solve the problem. And so the A3 problem-solving process really, I think, helps with that. It's not that people aren't smart enough to solve problems, they just don't have a structured way to do it. And many times when they don't have that structure, they'll jump into solutions right away, because we all know that you all wear 5 hats, and we have to put out fires pretty quickly and get on to the next thing because we've got a lot to do. And so the A3 problem-solving process really brings in, I think, a great structure to be able to help people all across the organization look and solve problems. Why is it difficult to solve problems in hospitals? These are just some, I think, lessons that I've learned over time, is that different departments see the problem differently. When you look at problems and issues, 2 departments can see those things completely differently. They're looking from their own perspective and not really looking at the total process throughout the organization. Again, we talked about leaping to solutions instead of really identifying what that root cause is. We want to make sure the solution is properly managed. Again, once we kind of implemented some of those solutions, it tends to drift back to how things usually worked before, because that's what people are most comfortable with. Anytime we're talking about problem solving, we're talking about change, and we know how difficult sometimes change can be for the people in our workforce. So why should we add structure to our problem solving process? It helps create a better thinking process for our staff. It's a great tool to understand the problem better, to communicate the problem with each other, and it definitely promotes a different way of coming to consensus on how to solve some of these problems. The great part about A3 is that we learn by doing, and A3 gives us a structured process to really solve that problem, to identify solutions to that problem. We're measuring the solutions to that problem so we can identify what's working, and probably more importantly, what's not working, so that we can try a different strategy to try to solve that particular problem. The advantages of a team-based approach to problem solving is that those who are closest to the work know their jobs the best, and they know what's going to work and what's not going to work. When we use a team-based problem solving model, we get a broader range of knowledge from the people that are involved because they come from multiple disciplines. You're going to get broader, greater solutions because, again, people are looking at it from different perspectives, different departments, so you're going to get more creative solutions than if it's just 1 or 2 people. You're going to get a greater chance of risk-taking. Again, when you have 5 to 7 people on a team, they're going to take bigger risks to solve the problem than if it's just 1 or 2 people, because if it doesn't work, those 1 or 2 people generally don't take a lot of risk because they don't want to implement something that may not work. Again, teams are very effective in working on complex problems. And once the problem is identified and the solution is implemented, there's a much, much higher degree of ownership by the people who are involved with trying to solve this particular problem. So team-based problem solving is really a powerful tool when it's applied correctly through the organization. As I talked about earlier, it's usually a team of 3 to 5 people. You have to have a champion or a process owner, somebody that's going to champion this particular problem-solving process. Again, we want good cross-functional representation. We want frontline people, the people that are closest to the actual process, to be part of that team. You're probably wondering, why do they call it A3? Well, it's for the simple fact that it's usually done on 11 by 17 paper, and that's what ledger paper is called, A3 in the United States. So it's not complex. It's really about having and identifying the problem on one sheet of paper that, as you'll see, is very visual and can very much help communicate what the problem is and how we're going to solve the particular problem. So this is what a typical form looks like for an A3. On the left-hand side, you'll see kind of the background and current conditions, what the goals and targets would be. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see what the analysis, root cause, what some of our countermeasures might be, what the root cause really looks like, the plan versus actual results once we put our solution into place, and then finally what the accountability will be. The great thing about A3 is it really follows the plan, do, check, act model. It's really based on that, and so we can really unleash that model throughout our organization because some of our folks in the front line who are not quality experts really become intimidated by some of the quality improvement models, and yet A3 follows that model, but I think it makes it very simple to do for folks across the organization. So the background is the first component that we talk about. It really clarifies what the problem is. We want it to be short, concise, and very clear about what the problem is. The current condition really, again, talks about, very similar to what we've talked about in value stream mapping. We want to know what the current process is and where the problem really lies. So we want to document what that current condition is. We want to have the goal, what specific targets we're going to look at to solve this particular problem. And then problem analysis, getting to the root cause of the problem and not looking at just the symptoms of the problem. And then on the right-hand side, again, the countermeasures, the specific actions that we're going to take to solve the problem. Then we want the effect confirmation. We want to make sure that what we did, the countermeasures we put into place, are actually working. So again, we need metrics to be able to do that. We need baseline data, and then we need follow-up data at a later point in time to make sure that our countermeasures are actually working. Then we need the follow-up action, the steps for improvement. If it's not working, what are we going to do to make further corrections? And if we did solve the problem and we can identify that we made the corrections, how are we going to make sure that those stay in place over time? So I'll run you through a quick little scenario of using A3 problem solving. Again, we'll use just a very simple little theme here to kind of go through each one of the areas. So in this particular example, the problem is we have an employee who has become tardy in the recent past, and you can see, again, the bullet points clearly stage what's going on, why it's important. We have a visual cue on the right-hand side that shows for the last 5 or 6 quarters what his tardiness was, and you can see it moved from almost nothing to a problem in the last couple of quarters, so we know we have a growing problem. So we lay out the current condition. Again, we use visual cues to map out the process of what the problem is. And again, we use bullet points to look at what the specific facts of the current condition are. Anytime we can use visuals, it really helps us identify and look at what the problem truly is. We identify our goals. What's the target? We want to reduce his tardiness. So we define specifically what that is and when we want that by, and we establish that standard. We use visuals to make sure that we're looking at what the old rate was, what the current rate is, and what our target is. We do the detective work in the root cause analysis stage, really looking at what are the things that are contributing to this particular problem, and try to identify those and make sure that we're any assumptions we're making that we're really confirming those. So this is where you do the detective work and the data collection on your problem. Then we implement the countermeasures. We decide which actions we're going to take, what specific action that's going to be, who's responsible, what the due date is, and then what the finding is after that due date. Then we look at the effect confirmation. Again, we gathered our baseline data in the beginning of this problem. We knew how many times he was tardy, and so we began to document, again, that over time after we put in our countermeasures. And we can see by the visual that we're beginning to bring the number of times that he was tardy back into the range that we set our goal for. And then finally, the follow-up actions, again, making sure that whatever we put into place stays, and we maintain the gains over time. And so we look at the action items to make sure that we can keep those gains in the process as we go forth. Again, the power of A3 is it's very simple. It's a very simple format based on really sophisticated thinking. And again, it really provides our teams with a way of looking at particular problems and everybody coming at it from the same direction. And when I work with organizations that really begin to implement A3, you know, when they begin to face problems, you know, people will just say, well, let's do an A3 on this particular problem, and we put our team together and we're off we go. And so everybody has a good idea of how to address the problem, how we're going to use A3, and it provides kind of a clear, concise communication about how we're going to do it. It's structured. People over time, like any skill, really get good at problem solving. Again, I think the power of A3 is not in the tool particularly itself. It's with the fact that you can develop a consistent way of solving problems throughout your organization. And probably more importantly, that you unleash people to solve problems on a consistent basis. I've worked with a lot of facilities where frontline people really don't feel like they're engaged or able to, even though they see problems, to really look at putting a process in place to solve those problems. So when you can get this throughout your culture and that everyone's a problem solver, and when they see problems, they're engaged to be able to solve those problems, it becomes a very powerful tool in your organization. So let's take a look at the final tool, standard work. Standard work is probably the most powerful tool in the Lean toolkit, but it's probably one of the least used tools in the toolkit because it is very difficult to standardize work in an organization. So let's take a look at what is standard work. It's really the most effective combination of activities in a process that minimize non-value added activities while providing high quality, valuable services to our patient. I think one of the best ways to think about standard work is really relating it to a recipe. You know, would you add eggs to an omelet before you crack them? Would you serve multiple meals to your family? Would we have 6 cooks in charge of a meal? No, you wouldn't do any of those things. And so standard work is really based, I think, one of the pictures you can think of it is really looking at it as a recipe. Standard work equals really a production recipe, and it should be based on the needs, again, in the flow of the system. So when we have a recipe, we have the precise amount of ingredients, exactly which ingredients we need, which amount we need, and then there's a defined sequence of putting that particular recipe together. And again, that's what we're trying to accomplish with standard work. We're trying to look at standard work because it helps us produce a more consistent output. It helps us manage things, materials, because we know what we need, we know what materials we need. So we use standard work for the same reasons that you would use a recipe in baking and putting together a meal. Again, the definition of standard work is really a simply described, most efficient way of putting a particular task or process together. And it's in a sequenced way where we know it's consistently followed, and there's a formalized way of doing that particular process. And standard work doesn't have to be a long, detailed document like some of our policies are, quite frankly, in our facilities. It really doesn't have to be that at all, because we all know that many times what happens in our facility really doesn't have any relationship to what our policy manual says. So again, what we're looking at in standardization is we're trying to reduce the variation of what happens in a particular process. When we have variation in a process, when you don't have it standardized, it's almost impossible to really improve that process because it varies so much from who does it, when they do it, what shift they do it. So again, the purpose of standard work is to try to standardize that as much as possible and reduce the variation in the process. Just to give an example of standard work instruction sheet, we would look at the name of the process, then we would have the specific task in which order they're supposed to be done in, what some of the key points are, how much time it should take for that particular step in the process, and then we use all the visuals we can to help people understand what the process is and what they're looking for. So we can use diagrams, we can use screenshots, anything that is visual can be used here, because we know from research there's more power in being able to see a visual cue than there is in just reading words in a particular document. So we want to, in standard work, we want to make sure we have our standard task, our sequence, our times that are involved, and again, we want to be able to see visually the flow of our work, and that really provides the platform for our improvement. Other benefits of standard work is that improves patient safety, worker safety, enhances our flow, it really clarifies our role, and again, drives variation out of our process. It also helps tremendously with training new staff and making sure that people are doing it the correct way the first time. Without standard work, processes degrade over time, our performance decreases, We see in our processes an increase in complexity because we have certain parts of the process that break down. So what do? We add 3 or 4 more steps to try to solve that problem. And then over time, that's why our processes are so complex. So without standard work, again, the likelihood of variation in the process is pretty tremendous. Standard work really helps drive improvement, as I mentioned before. Without standard work, without trying to drive variation out of our processes, it's really quite hard to really get a process and really streamline it again, because we have so much variation in the process. So standard work, again, a very powerful tool, and we've just covered the basics of it here today, but it is, in my mind, probably the most needed tool in many of our facilities. We're very good at identifying problems, beginning to put solutions to those problems in our facilities, but what we really don't do very well is putting the standard work in to make sure that it's done the same way each and every time, regardless of which shift it is, day shift, night shift, regardless of what school you went to, where you got your training, just again making sure it's done the same way each and every time.